then,
Okay, we're on.
okay.
All right, here we go. Thank you, Mr. Gregg, and let's get started.
I need to adjust your camera, Jefferson.
So anyways, that's going to happen, and I know Russ is trying to figure out how WJTN can figure out if they could broadcast that first game. I'm not sure the logistics of that. I know there's sponsorships, I mean, there's dollars and cents.
Yeah, but Andrew's been working with Jacob on it. I have
Okay.
stayed out of the discussions because I don't get into the dollars and cents aspects of it.
All good. It's a good thing to do, not get involved.
Okay, we're good.
All right, now here we go.
Yeah.
Hello, from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown. I'm Denis Webster from radio station WJTN. Welcome to the fourth in a series of interviews with Greg Peterson, one of the founders of the center and a partner with the Phillips Lytle Law Firm working in the Jamestown office. Together, we've been exploring how the Jackson Center came to be and how it honors the life and work of Robert H. Jackson. Greg, thank you once again for coming back to share more of your story.
Well, thank you for continuing to ask the good questions.
The Jackson Center is celebrating its 20th anniversary. In earlier editions of this series, Greg talked about people who came along, events that fell into place, leading to the founding of the center and its location here in this building. He also sketched out some of the early programming priorities and how the archive of Robert H. Jackson material was undertaken. One of the other key components of the Jackson Center that emerged in the first 5 or 6 years was the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues. It is there that we begin today. I fudged a little bit on the beginning of the dialogues because I know the first one was in 2007, but there were some things that happened before that that sort of led up to the Law Dialogue series. Give us the Greg Peterson backstory on that.
We at the Jackson Center are we're always mindful of anniversaries. And in 2005, we knew that was the 60th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial. So I reached out to Fredonia State to see if they might be willing to provide some academic bolster and Chautauqua Institution as a location for a potential gathering of academics, prosecutors, et cetera. And they all agreed, and in fact, we planned it. And I thought, one of the people I would like to invite, though I had no clue how to do so, was a guy named David Crane. David Crane was from Syracuse University. He had been the chief and founding prosecutor of the Sierra Leone Tribunal, and by definition, the first American to be a chief prosecutor since Robert H. Jackson. So therefore, in the lineage of life, there's Jackson, who died in 1954, and then there's David Crane. How do I get a hold of him? So through a bunch of serendipity and a trustee of Syracuse University, where I knew David had just come back to, I got a hold of him directly, asked him if he would be interested in coming to our event at Chautauqua in 2005. David said, well, I'm now teaching, but I'll squeeze it in. And he literally drove from Syracuse on a morning in his little MG car, got to Chautauqua at 11:30 a.m. for a 12:30 p.m. 1-hour speech, and then turned around and had to go back and give a lecture that evening. Squeezed it in, but he did it. And during that time, I did an interview because I have access to the guy who's the legacy from Jackson. So he gave me 25 minutes. I remember this distinctly. Bada bang, what's Jackson mean to you, David Crane? You're this. And we struck a friendship up, which found form the next year in Bowling Green University. Bowling Green University had likewise, under our encouragement, brought together various academics, again, continuing the 60th anniversary cycle. And David was there as a speaker because he had been met by people from Bowling Green. So he literally re-engaged at a coffee. And at that coffee, this is the magic of it all, David said, you know, I love Chautauqua, my 1 hour there. How cool is that to be on the porch, et cetera, et cetera. And, one of the things that I have access to are all of the chief prosecutors of the other tribunals, which was Yugoslavia, which was Rwanda, which was Cambodia, and we don't get a chance to meet. Wouldn't it be great if we could have a retreat of the prosecutors, which also, I should mention, the International Criminal Court? And I said, hey, if you got access and you can bring the talent, I will provide the venue. So in 2007, we planned, and it delivered the first International Humanitarian Law Dialogue, and David delivered, bringing all of the chief prosecutors to Chautauqua, chief prosecutor, I mean, the number one guys, people, and when the word got out, all of the deans of various law schools came to be in the audience. It was unbelievable, because they wanted to touch these guys. They didn't know how to reach them. So this all happened in 2007, but it came as a result of what we did 2 years prior.
A couple of things we ought to do here for the viewer of this program. One is to establish the fact that what happened, what started at Nuremberg with the impetus of Robert H. Jackson and others from the United States and other nations, was a first, but it was not the only or the last. It began a series of international trials, prosecutions for similar accusations of crimes against humanity, if not genocide, similar sorts of deeply serious things, one nation committed against another, one people committed against another. And that's a series of prosecutions that goes on as we speak.
As we speak. It's important to note that after Nuremberg, it was hoped that that would be the last one necessary to hold individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, but not the case. Wars went on in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and the United Nations created ad hoc tribunals, which were then supported, which occurred shortly after the end of the Cold War. And so those were started. And so Rwanda, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, various atrocities that occurred, the United Nations would set up these tribunals, and they all had chief prosecutors. So as a result, it got a very small club, but a very active and high-profile club. And as a result, they came here to retreat.
This is reminiscent of something that occurred a little earlier, a couple of times in the series of interviews. But once again, the magic opportunity that you helped create for the Robert H. Jackson Center when the people who worked with Jackson on the court, his clerks, who hadn't gotten together for a long time, suddenly were brought together by the Robert H. Jackson Center. People who worked with him at Nuremberg, who had not been in contact with one another after that time, they'd gone on with their lives, and suddenly they were brought back together at the Robert H. Jackson Center, or under the auspices of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And now, in a similar fashion, these international prosecutors who are disparate around the world and working on different cases and programs, and from what you said, don't regularly get together at one particular place or point in time, now are getting together in one particular place at a point in time under the name of the Robert H. Jackson Center.
And we've been blessed that that has continued on. I honestly thought we would have one and done. When we did the first one, it was incredibly successful, but I thought it was to gather them for the second, third, and fourth, and now we're this summer planning to be in London for what will be the 14th.
Why is it important for the Jackson Center to be involved in an effort that brings these prosecutors together, or those who are associated with such trials today, in one place? What does that mean in the context of the work of this center?
Well, I think one part of what our mission is to advance the legacy of Robert H. Jackson and its relevance today. The legacy comes from the Nuremberg trial. Clearly, the Nuremberg trial was the first, made out of whole cloth. The architect was Justice Jackson. And that legacy lives on through tribunals today. And to hear from those prosecutors what it is they use in their best practices from Nuremberg is important. And also to hear from their voices today how that has evolved, how some of the lessons learned at Nuremberg have now been shaped, reshaped reaffirmed and used in other manners to hopefully deter despots from committing war crimes. Nobody's naive enough to think that somehow convicting of these presidents, dictators, will eliminate it, but it might detract it. It might deter it if, in fact, those individuals may end up behind bars for 50 years.
Tell me just in a phrase or two what you intend to accomplish in London, England later this year.
Last year, we were scheduled to be in London on August 8th, which was the completion of the London Agreement, which was an agreement negotiated by Robert Jackson among the Allied countries to have a trial and to define what the trial's crimes might be, where it would be held, and the rules of the trial itself. Unprecedented. That perhaps in the scheme of all of Jackson accomplished at the Nuremberg scene, that negotiation, that treaty, is the template upon which the trial was held subsequently in Nuremberg, and the trial that was held in Tokyo, and trials that have been held thereafter. So the fact that it was a first of a kind, all of the prosecutors, all the alums were all going to convene in London to kind of discuss that. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way. They did have a virtual, which is very well received, but not quite the same of being there at the location in Whitechapel in London. So our hope is, COVID permitting, that might do that here in August.
Considering the number of international law dialogues that have occurred, Greg Peterson, and the fact that we are on a limited timetable here, I will just ask you if there are one or two events or people or things that emerged from any one of them that really changed your approach to the work you're doing here at the Robert H. Jackson Center, or really changed your approach to the law? Are there impressionable moments that you can recall from any of them?
Boy, so many.
Sorry.
I think the fact that at the end, the conclusion of all of these law dialogues, there is a statement. It's called the Chautauqua Declaration. And it's a document signed by all of the prosecutors, which then in turn has international press that goes with that. And the fact that they all talk about a commonality of from Jackson's legacy to what they're accomplishing and what they hope to accomplish, the aspiration. And through that, at the same time, we've had, 60, 70 of the biggest names in international criminal law here. I think it's the fact, the sum total, that we've been able to, what's been able to be accomplished here by having those people exposed to Jackson Center. I should point out, every event starts here. A Sunday evening, big gala event. So they all touch this place. And then we spend a couple of days at Chautauqua. But they then in turn, talk about impressions, know that they in turn go out into their worlds as ambassadors for what we're doing here. So here in Jamestown, New York, all of a sudden, it's got an international play. To me, that's what's remarkable and meaningful.
There is a vast subject that we're just going to skip over here, but I just want to acknowledge that the trajectory, the path of international justice, or paths that it has taken since the Nuremberg war crimes trials is interesting, fascinating, and challenging, I think, all at the same time to begin to embrace, and it will be a subject for another time because it is not really the function of this interview except to acknowledge that it is a very active area of inquiry and interest in the world in many different ways today.
Absolutely.
And I'll leave it there. Our purpose is more to talk about and to have you recall for us the origins of the center and how it developed in the years that we are talking about here. And it occurred to me that one of the things we should do as a tribute to the building of the center and the people who helped you, to just have you comment on those who have been the directors, the executive directors or presidents of the Robert H. Jackson Center through the years that it has existed. You, in one of our earlier interviews, said that the first director nominated himself and gave himself the job, and that was, at that time, the recently retired Dr. Daniel Bratton from Chautauqua Institution, who just left the presidency there at that time, sat in a meeting in this room and volunteered to start leading the organization. Talk to us about his contributions and the abrupt end to his life and how it went on from there, Greg.
You captured the segue perfectly. Dan dove right in. The first week, he had a previously arranged meeting with Justice O'Connor, who had befriended President Bratton while at Chautauqua. Long story and relationship there, but just so happened. And so Dan went down shortly after our meeting here with Carl Kappa and Betty Lene and sat down with Dan, and he always told us with great vigor, and he said, sat down, and they were at the same table across from each other, and Justice O'Connor, what are you doing, Dan? And Dan goes, well, I'm retired. What are you doing, Dan? And he goes, well, I'm thinking about moving to Arizona. Dan, what are you doing? Just kept barreling in. He goes, well, I've just decided I would be the executive director to help out this brand new Robert H. Jackson Center. And she goes, he's the greatest. Have you done X, Y, and Z, and so on? And he goes, I haven't really, I don't even know where the men's room is. So she reaches under her desk and hands Dan a legal pad. Mark this down. And so, first of all, we are going to call the Library of Congress and see if they have a finder's aid for all of Jackson's material. One. Two, we're going to call the Supreme Court Historical Society and see if you can meet with them this afternoon, Dan, so you can make a contact there. Three, so she went down this list of 8 items. Dan, a secretary now, making notes. So then she gets on the phone and calls the head curator of the Library of Congress.
Now, she's a sitting Supreme Court justice
Sitting
at this
Supreme
moment,
Court justice.
so has some authority.
Yeah, so when she calls the Library of Congress and asks for the head curator,
They answer.
and they answer. So you can hear the heels click, as Dan would say. You can hear the heels click. He goes, I have Dan Bratton here. He's the new executive director of the Robert H. Jackson Center. Of course, you have the Robert H. Jackson files. I wonder if you could meet with him this afternoon. Yes, Madam, Justice. And they make an arrangement later that afternoon. Then she calls the Supreme Court Historical Society. And of course, same thing. And he meets with them. And it just went on. So Dan comes back 2 days later and just aglow. You're not going to believe this, Greg, but this is what happened. And sure enough, the curator, library, called me, and the next thing you know, though they had not had a finder's aid, they were going to make that a priority to take Jackson's archives and make a finder's aid so anybody who would want to research could do so.
Now, this is prior to the era of the easy Google search you
Oh,
might have
absolutely.
today.
Yeah, so now you have a document that says this. And then in turn, he said, do you think there's an opportunity I said, is there an opportunity to get this microfilmed? Because the documents are in Washington, and you have to go to Washington and beg that. And sure enough, they said, I think we can make that happen. So I came back and working through the Community Foundation and some sponsors, we got the money to pay the Library of Congress to microfilm the entire Jackson archives, which we have, and which is subsequently that microfilm became digitized, and it's so on today. You don't have to go to Washington to see the Jackson archives. They're here. But that started with Dan. And the next thing, Dan contracted pancreatic cancer. And that was this very sad day. It happened to be the same day that the Scottish Rite Consistory had voted the approval of the sale of the contract to us. And this is poignant.
For this building.
This building. Poignant because I called him. I said, Dan, great news. He goes, I'm so excited for you. I mean, very kind of matter-of-factly and goes, I don't know if I'll be with you to see it much longer. And I go, what? He goes, well, I just got back from the doctor, and he diagnosed I got pancreatic cancer. And talk about, but I'm going to work with you, Greg. I'm going to work with you. So you'd say, wow,
Yeah.
what a phone call. And so what happened was, and this is a real tribute to Dan Braden, and I know we're spending extraordinary time on him, but he deserves it. He actually, in his pain, made a couple visits down here, extended board meetings, but at the same time wrote a memorandum, well, maybe it's even longer, a thesis, if you will, on his view of the Jackson Center. It exists, and when you read it today, hopefully we've done justice to Dan's vision. It's spectacular. What a visionary. That he would, in his pain, and I know his wife has said how much that helped him during that time to be active, mentally active. So we have that. And then when Dan passed, it was a real loss for the community, certainly a loss for us, but his legacy stayed on many, many fronts, and his wife and family stayed on in many forms.
I want to interrupt you here just to do two things quickly, Greg. One, you mentioned the Jackson Archive, and we've made passing reference to this before, but I'm just curious to know how extensive that Library of Congress, a set of documents, microfilm, digital, whatever form it is in now. Is it a lot of stuff?
Well, in the Library of Congress, there's lots, boxes and boxes and boxes. What we have is the digitization of those boxes. So there's DVDs, I suspect, at this point, that if somebody wanted to take the finding aid, say I'd like to look at Jackson's memo to President Truman on the Nuremberg trial, you could just download it and bada bing.
And people come here and can find that?
Correct.
And it must be quite extensive in terms of what it reveals if you spend enough time
Correct.
getting into it about Robert H. Jackson.
No question. I've only touched the tip of the iceberg. I know where it is, but there's so much more there.
I also want to get back to Sandra Day O'Connor for just a moment because as a Supreme Court justice, before there was the idea for a Jackson Center and there was just Greg Peterson and a camera, and this is what you related to us in an earlier part of this series, down near Love School in Jamestown, what was to become Jackson Square, and she came and made a speech about Jackson for the dedication of his statue there. Talk about what you know of how she became part of Chautauqua Institution and how she sort of re-entered the scene here at the Jackson Center.
Insofar as the Chautauqua Institution relationship, I believe it comes through her husband. Her husband had, during his summer, college worked at the Athenaeum Hotel, dishwasher, something like that. Subsequently, she and her husband's friends, the Campbells, were Chautauquans and got invited up for a week. And that then led to relationships where she would appear weekly or once a week during every season. She spoke several times at Chautauqua, befriended the Brattons. And when we had when I say we, the community had the opportunity to dedicate the Jackson statue, I think it was Philip Morris reached out to Dan Braden to see if he could pull a string or two and see if Justice O'Connor might come down, and they planned it around her being at Chautauqua. My wife was the driver, drove her down here in 1996, so that's why I knew pretty much the timing and everything for my own filming purposes. And she obviously spoke highly of Jackson, which then triggered a lot of things. We talked about that prior on the camera. And then come 2001 with Dan Braden meeting with Justice O'Connor, that memo. And then when she would come back, she wanted, she would have her grandchildren and she wanted babysitters, and my kids were babysitters. So all kinds of stuff. So we connected somewhat. I don't want to say we were friends, but we had her down here at the center on a couple of occasions honoring her. Kind of just to honor her on what she did to help Dan Bratton. I told the story and all of that, and she would come down here, and on a couple occasions, she opened up doors for us in Washington, on not only what we just talked about, 2001, but subsequently, we had a pretty good contact through her staffers, and if we had a need, and we didn't use it often, but when the time permitted, she somehow delivered, and I was always grateful, and the highlight of which for me is she signed a baseball for me, so that's the big thing.
More we could say on that subject too, but we are primarily focused at this moment on talking about the executive directors of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and after the death of Dr. Daniel Bratton, what came next? How did you move on from there?
Yeah, we had a void. Dan, I believe, died in May of 2001. A new board member at that time was Raleigh Kidder, because of his extensive experience in a variety of things, but including World War II history, being a lawyer, being a lot of things, businessman. And he was contemplating retiring from his investment job. So I remember talking to him at a wedding and wondering if he might be interested, and he said, I might be. And the next thing you know, he went from being a board member to our executive director in, I think, November of 2001. He had agreed to be our executive for 5 years. He gave us a 5-year contract, and we worked that out, and exactly 5 years he gave us. And he continues to this day to be interested and engaged, but as executive director. And for Raleigh, being a former assemblyman and being connected with all things Albany, was incredibly helpful in working with the state government, the Assembly, the Senate. At that time, Bill Parment was our assemblyman, Pat McGee and subsequently Kathy Young were our assembly people, and they were incredibly interested in our organization, and therefore capital money, which we needed for the theater, downstairs, things that we needed to as we were building out. It was very, very helpful, and Raleigh could speak their language, and he helped us on so many fronts, Raleigh did, but that especially.
Well, and that kind of influence is essential because people may be aware there's that money available, in good times at least, to help organizations such as this, but you've got to be able to connect with the right people to pitch the story, and he must have been able to get there and get to the right people on your behalf.
No question.
Well, you know, and we're talking about a time now in the period of the early 2000s when you are settling into this building, you are settling into a rhythm of programming here, and really establishing yourself for real as the Robert H. Jackson Center.
This was a really a growing opportunity for us. We clearly had we know where we wanted to go strategically. We didn't, money is always important, funding to make that a reality. At the same time, with Chief Justice Rehnquist coming in 2003 and a whole other programming which was going to come on the Browns, the Barnetts, the Korematsus, all of that was an excuse for us to reach out to other donors to enhance the facility. If we're going to showcase, bring in this high-end programming, we got to have the facility to support that. So again, Raleigh was in the middle of all of that. I was probably the idea guy for the programs, but Raleigh was there saying, all right, we got to make sure this is presentable, and whether it was the Linnae flagpole or the Weeks room or the Bergen, Robbins, Dale Robbins, and Holtquist, and boy, I go down this foundations, I'm going to be embarrassed now, but Gabby and Sheldon, and they all chipped in. And what you see here today was a result of a lot of collaborative efforts from a lot of people.
So Raleigh gives you those 5 years, and then you move on from there. Who came next?
We had we did a search, and Don Greenhouse was an interim. Don, former trustee of Chautauqua Institution, a financial guy, came and he was helping us, and so he sort of sat in that position while we subsequently found Adam Bratton, Dan Bratton's son, and Adam was here for a couple of years, having come from working down at Allegheny College in an administrative capacity. to sort of carry on the legacy of Dan. Adam subsequently got a chance to go to Erie, to a not-for-profit there, and then he left that time, so we had another void, if you will, while we were looking at a national search. Tom Schmidt came in and helped us. He had just retired as a superintendent. He became our interim during that time period. And then we, again, serendipitously, one of the people who was a part of the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues as the #2 prosecutor at the Sierra Leone Tribunal, Jim Johnson, had retired, just retired. And was coming back to the States, so through a connect there with Dave Crane, Jim threw his hat in the ring, and he came and became our executive director for a period of time here during a time where we really established our international law presence, and Jim, having been part of that community, was very much aware and part of that. Do you want me to just continue here?
Well, I'm just interested in Jim for a moment, because the perspective that you brought up earlier, Greg, about the international law dialogues and the prosecutors coming together and then hiring someone who had to run this place, who had done that work, must have added a certain amount of additional prestige to what you were doing at that level among those people who, that select group who continued to work in the field at that time.
No question. As far as the international law process, which is, of course, one of the three legs, if you will, of our mission, with the domestic, the international law, and Jackson's personal life, that really enhanced us. That put a little brighter Klieg light on it, and because of Jim's connections, we were able to get access to even more people and more programs, and we did some road shows to Nuremberg. We did some, which was terrific exposure for not only donors, but the staff as well.
Let us move on then, in the interest of time, past Jim Johnson and into the more modern era of the Robert H. Jackson Center.
Jim retired and went on to teach, as he's continuing to teach at Case Western University School of Law. And then we had another search, and during that time period, we got Susan Murphy. Susan Murphy came as our Chief Executive Officer, previously on the board of Chautauqua Institution, and also a director of a not-for-profit in Detroit. She had a place at Chautauqua, wanted to come to Chautauqua County to permanently stay, and she did so. She was here for 3 years. And then when she left, we had variously Tom Schmidt and Dee Kathman as our interims. And now we have Kristen McMahon. Kristen McMahon, it's always good to know how do these things happen. But we were in a search, and Stan Lundeen, who was head of the search committee, called me. I was not part of the committee, and said, Greg, I wonder if you could reach out to Michael Hill, newly installed president of Chautauqua Institution, to see if in his world he might have some ideas. So I did, and Mike grilled me for like a half an hour what this job might be, entail, da-da-da-da-da-da, and he said, I think I might have somebody. That's all he said. And the next thing you know, I get a call from Kristen McMahon, who suggested that she talked to Michael Hill and wanted to know more, et cetera, et cetera. And as it turned out, I was going to be in Washington the next week. I said, for a concert of my son was having, I said, if you want, come join us for the concert. And at the same time, I'm going to have Julia Craighill there. And Julia is the granddaughter of Robert Jackson, and you two guys will have a chance to meet. So in Washington, D.C., at a concert of Brent Peterson, in the audience sat Julia Craighill, Kristen McMahon. I was running around filming, and
Not surprising.
They met, and things progressed.
What is the role of the executive director, or now president, as Kristen has the title here, of the Robert H. Jackson Center? What considering your long experience with the center from its founding to this moment, Greg Peterson, what can you say to us about the importance of that person and what the job is?
Well, in a word, it's the face of the Jackson Center. And what does that mean? You know, you have certain constituencies. Foremost are donors, current donors, potential donors, and to be able to talk to them about what it is we are doing, have done, are doing, and hope to do, and that is critical. So being concerned about the sustainability of the Robert H. Jackson Center through outreach, and again, that's donor outreach, community outreach, and that all finds substance in programs, you know. So, and Kristen has been very creative, and especially during this pandemic time period, of creating virtual Thursday teas with Jackson, which I, twice a month, finding people who are on a national and international level to interview about social justice issues, which have a kind of a connection with Jackson and its legacy today. And at the same time, communicating socially, best way we can, to those stakeholders, of which there are many, about our mission to keep us relevant. We're at a time where you physically can't come here much. We hope that changes. But in the meantime, you got to keep the touch points. Otherwise, when we can open up, they may have forgotten about you.
Well, and we are in a most unusual time, as you suggest, with the engine running and the transmission in neutral in many, many ways in our lives here these days, including at the Robert H. Jackson Center. But one other thing I'd like to do before we move on to another area of conversation, Greg, is just have you take us behind the curtain for a moment and talk to us about how things get done here, or how things have gotten done here over the years in terms of your extraordinary contribution and creative mind in terms of potential programs that can be done here, and your unending zest for Robert H. Jackson and the mission of this place. There is a board of directors, there is a staff, there have been the executive directors, and now the president. How does all of that function together behind the scenes to make it all work? Tell us your perspective on that.
Well, it really starts at the executive level, you know, president, CEO. Clearly, I had some, you know, opportunities early on, but it was all ultimately the Raleigh Kidders, the Dan Braddens, the Adam Braddens, those people who may have heard my wild, crazy idea and with a suggestion and then turn it into reality. There is an active board which has its own degrees of contacts. And one of the challenges, if you will, is to understand those board members and where they have their spheres of influence, and to help them help us with the Jackson Center. And they always do it gracefully if you tell them or encourage them to say, hey, I know you know somebody, I wonder if you could make a call for the good of the cause. And that happens a lot. So there are a lot of early morning kind of wake up epiphany moments saying, when you talk to somebody, that's the behind the curtain stuff, say, is this a good idea or a crazy idea? And somebody will give you a gut check and say, Greg, you missed the mark again, you know, or saying, let's work on it. And then off you go with a plan of action. So that's much of how it happens, and it's a village. It is a village of people who not only vet it, but also make it happen. And even today, there's a very active, you know, Kristen has her sphere of influence of people and has her own ideas, and it's really worked very well.
Well, and how many people are on the board of directors?
There's, I believe now, the number is probably 16, 17 board members. There are only 4 staff people, so it's a very modest organization. And there has been a significant number of academic and not-for-profit collaborations. I think in today's world, to be successful, you got to have that.
I was just about to touch on that in terms of the success and the ongoing, just paying the bills at an institution such as this. This is not a place in which you charge admission and have thousands of people come through and make significant amounts of money that way. So you must find funding to continue the work to preserve and protect and tell the world about the legacy of Robert H. Jackson and do all the other things that you do here. Someone's got to come up with the money to do that. And I'd just like to have you address that particular aspect of this work for a moment, Greg.
Sure. Every not-for-profit is going to be dealing with the operations of and covering the operating nut. We have a big building. It's a 19,000 square foot building. We have staff, and that has been supported by individual donors, by foundations, and we do have an endowment, albeit a modest one, at this point, but it's growing. And that all, the sum total of which covers the budget. It's a never-ending story until somebody really significant covers the nut. But so far, we don't have any debt here. I'm happy to say that. If there's one thing that we take pride in at the Jackson Center today, we have no debt. Now, I don't think, not every not-for-profit can say that. And so we're thrilled to say that, and we hopefully will have programming, ongoing programming, stimulating enough and relevant enough so that we'll continue to have that support.
I just want to ask one other question that might be on the minds of viewers of this, because they know, if they've watched any of this or just know you at all, of your extraordinary contribution to this place from its inception to this moment. And you are active, have been active on the board. You just left the board this past December, and we're speaking now in March of 2021. But you never made that transition from being a board member to being the executive director. You did never want that job.
No.
Or did you?
No.
At least you haven't yet. I mean, there's still...
No. It's critical that there is a distance between being the founder, if you're one of the co-founders, and kind of, I had his day job, and a very good day job, and Philip Lytle has been very supportive, and part of that support has been permitting me to do what I can do as a board member and for a period of time president, which was a board level activity. But no, as far as the executive director day job, perhaps I was encouraged once or twice, but it never, it's important. And it's important for the sustainability. Perhaps just a little personal note. I was blessed to be involved at the beginning with Carl, Betty, Dan, and that's wonderful. And therefore, folks, certainly in the early days, I became the face of the place, among others. But nevertheless, and so important for the sustainability that be, for the good of the institution, that be moved away, that I step back, not going to affect my interest in this place. I've got a keen interest in the success of this and the sustainability of it. But for the long haul, it's new board members, it's new blood, it's new executive directors, and we do have that. And from the chairman, Leah Weinberg, to new board members, it's terrifically moving. So one way to find failure is the fact of one of the co-founders stays around too long.
Well, I appreciate that, and just was curious, and I know others would be too, about why many things happened, but that particular one did not. We generally try to keep these interviews to an hour or so, and we have a few minutes left in today's program, Greg Peterson, maybe enough to at least begin to tell the story. William Rehnquist was Chief Justice of the United States and came here and spoke, and you yourself spoke quite eloquently and in detail about what it took to get him here and speak. One Chief Justice would have been a remarkable accomplishment, but you have two to your credit here. How is it that Rehnquist's successor, John Roberts, came to be a speaker on the front porch of the Robert H. Jackson Center?
Chief Justice Roberts became Chief Justice in 2005 or 6, and everybody knew the legacy. Jackson's law clerk was Rehnquist, Rehnquist's law clerk was Roberts, so therefore he's part of the family, whether he fully appreciates that or not. So, of course, I sent a letter to him. He had just, frankly, newly minted. And
The
because
day
of,
after he got the job?
just
kinda?
about, yeah. And sent the letter and probably a follow-up letter inviting him at any time he wants. You know, it's his call. And because he's a Buffalo guy, he's born in Buffalo, Western New York, another Western New York lawyer. I threw out everything out there, kitchen sink. So about after probably my second letter, I got a call. I had a call from his staff, and I'll never forget it. And he goes, Chief Justice has your letter. He appreciates it. He recognizes that his boss was here, and he appreciates the high integrity of Justice Jackson. And in fact, Chief Justice Roberts spoke about it at his confirmation hearing. And he is willing to come. Yeah. Fantastic. He thinks it would be appropriate to come on the 10th anniversary of when his boss, Chief Justice Rehnquist, spoke, the 10th anniversary to the day. So now, this is about 2006, 2007. I'm getting this conversation, and I go, I'm starting to do the math in my head. I go, holy cow, that's a long
How many years out?
ways out. And what are you going to say? Of course. Thank you. This is fantastic. And I hope I'm around. So fast forward, we just knew Roberts was going to come sometime. That date, 2013. And so we went through executive directors. I mean, a whole lot of board turnover. Everything happened. And I remember I called in the end of 2011. I had the number. I haven't talked to anybody since then. And the same guy picked up and he goes, Greg, I suspect you're calling to see if we're still on for coming May 17th, 2013. I said, yes, and I'm so relieved. A, you're there. B, you said what you said, because I assume you are. And so then we spent the next year dotting I's, crossing T's, till ultimately he did come here and wowed everybody. We had a dinner the night before at Chautauqua Institution. I guess this is behind the curtain. And that same staff person who's got this long list of what the schedule's going to look like said, what would you like him to say at this dinner? I said, breathe. I mean, just get up and say something. And I said, do you think he might be willing to be interviewed? And he said, well, normally he does not, but what's your pitch? And I go, when Chief Justice Roberts was an associate at Hogan and Hartson in Washington, a litigation associate, his boss was E. Barrett Prettyman Jr., who was Robert Jackson's last law clerk and our current board member. And I would like to propose that I interview Chief Justice Roberts and his boss, Barrett Prettyman, to talk about life as a lawyer in a private law firm.
And this is something you came up with on the spur of the
On the
moment?
spot, man. It was just because at least they wanted a pitch. And
you found one?
I found one. So he said, yeah, I'll consider that. Do you think Barrett will do it? I said, I know Barrett will do it. I did not know that. Anyways, of course, they came back and said, yes, they would. Now, I called Barrett and I said, would you be willing to do that? Well, of course. And there are documents that he had, which has E. Barrett Prettyman Jr., arguments before the Supreme Court, where E. Barrett Prettyman Jr. would argue, and then they would list all the associates underneath it, and on the bottom was John G. Roberts. So, of course, we had to bring that up. But the postscript to what was a wonderful evening is I like to do what we're doing right here.
Sure.
Film it. And I called the guy back and said, Barrett Prettyman would do it. And by the way, do you mind if we film it? And the stock answer was, he does not permit filming private events. He will permit, obviously, filming public events. There's a red line, bright red line. And I go, oh, this is a chance of a lifetime. Can I appeal? Can I appeal this decision? And
Counselor.
Steve, his name, Steve goes, Greg, give it a shot. I said, well, this is an incredible, historical moment for Justice Roberts because he'll be on the same stage with his boss, Barrett Prettyman. And I tell you what, I will give it to you, and then you can look and decide whether you want this private event public. I'll concede, I'll give you the copy.
Huh.
And he got back and said, called the next day, and he goes, I've talked to the Chief Justice. He's granted your motion. So we filmed it, and it's now subsequently on YouTube. You can watch it, and it came out incredibly well. Barrett Prettyman was beside himself. The Chief Justice Roberts, I've been told, was happy with what he saw. Certainly the clerk watched it with like a hawk because he wanted to make sure his boss looked good. And so that passed, and the rest is history. But that's one of those behind-the-curtain stories. The rest was public. Chief Justice Roberts could not have had a better day. I mean, it was a Norman Rockwell moment. Time for one story, one final story. I have, personally, a baseball. And I got to tell the story. It's at my office. I'm not telling you where my office is. When Chief Justice Rehnquist was here, I knew he was a baseball fan. I also knew that Robert Jackson had nothing to do with baseball. I get often asked, what's the connection, Greg, between your passion and Jackson, your passion with baseball? How does that connect? And I have spent hours with all the clerks of Jackson, all the biographers of Jackson. Is there any? And the answer is no.
He didn't
None.
care.
Didn't care. Not a guy, he participated in sports, boating and horseback drag, but as far as watching, a spectator, no interest. But I knew Rehnquist was. So when I was driving him to the airport, or in the car with him, all the way as we're going to this private jet that's taking him back to Washington, I had in my bag a baseball. And I kept telling him about, you are the only connect I can make, Chief Justice Rehnquist, between baseball interest and Jackson. Would you sign the baseball? And he had been talking like a chatterbox all the way up, and it stopped. Dead silence. And I go, oh my gosh. Maybe he didn't hear. Maybe his hearing aid got off. I don't know what happened. So it just silent. So a long story short, I kept kind of trying to get back to the subject all the way to the tarmac of the Jamestown airport. And then finally, when we get on the tarmac, I'm walking up to the plane, I have the ball up. I'm kind of like begging. And they kind of looked at me and signed it. Because he wasn't signing anything other than his book. That was the game. But he signed the baseball. So I came back that night to have the baseball. Now, 10 years later, I have the baseball. And I was told by the marshals, he really doesn't like to sign stuff, Chief Justice Roberts. He'll pose for 1 million pictures. But he really doesn't want to be stop and sign. So I told everybody, no signing. But here I am with him 10 minutes before he goes on stage. We're in Raleigh's, or the executive director's room, and we're ready to walk on stage, and I'm got that 10-minute moment. We're kind of chit-chatting around. And I pulled out the baseball. And I go, I know, Mr. Chief Justice, I've been told not to ask you to do this. I am violating that law. However, your boss is here. And this is going to be ultimately for the center. And he goes, you're right. I normally don't do this because I don't want it on eBay. I don't want this. But given the circumstances, he signed it. So I have a baseball. signed by William Rehnquist and John G. Roberts, Jr., I am sure it's one of one. There are no others. So that's ultimately will be a possession, probably a very prized possession here at the Jackson Center.
Viewers really need to latch on to the gist of that story, Greg, because it says so much about you and your approach to this center and maybe all of life in terms of seeing what might be possible that's a couple of barriers away or a locked gate or two away from you, and then pretending like the locked gate is not there. And that has emerged so often during the course of these interviews. That's your style.
Yeah, for better or worse, that's a style. And as long as you do it with enthusiasm and with a smile on your face, probably a lot of otherwise might seem like barriers, do melt away. And if you, by the way, if you never ask, you'll never know.
Well, and you've said that to me previously in this interview series, and I know there must be times in which you mounted all of that enthusiasm, and if I could use the reference from your most recent story here, you didn't get the baseball sign. There must be a lot of those too.
You don't always hit home runs, yeah. And you don't, yeah, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. And if there is a message, perhaps, when you have an idea, follow up, follow through till its logical end. And hopefully the logical end is what it is that you would like it to be. But if it isn't, you've learned along the way. And certainly you'll find many more successes than failures.
Well, and there's a little psychological lesson in here too that you're teaching us, and that is that even if you're not sure of your own idea or you haven't finished fleshing it out, working it out, so long as you're enthusiastic about your idea, you have a better chance of it being successful than if you express or demonstrate that uncertainty.
That's right.
John Roberts, when he was here, though, what did he say up on the front porch of this building, and what did it mean to this center? Spend a few minutes on that, as we did similarly with Chief Justice Rehnquist when he was here. Did Roberts speak to Jackson's legacy?
Absolutely. He not only talked about the history of the Supreme Court, he talked about those giants of the Supreme Court, including Jackson, quoted him extensively about executive powers, the Youngstown Steel Seizure case, the Barnett case, and how fortunate we are of his ability to write well, write convincingly, and write understandably. And that has had a tremendous impact on him personally and the court generally, so that his legacy, which might not have been fully appreciated during his life, continues to have enhanced qualities that are useful today. And I think we've seen that in virtually every confirmation hearing of a Supreme Court justice, and even most recently with the Attorney General, talking about Jackson. It's the coinage of the Washington Beltway to use Jackson, Democrats and Republicans. And Roberts underscored that. And that was a remarkable moment, and he too writes with clarity and speaks with clarity, and so to have a man of his high station say what he said when he said it in front of a massive audience, it was magic.
I don't know if there's cause and effect here or not, Greg Peterson, but if you had not done what you had done here, along with others in building the Jackson Center, would that coinage be there today?
Oh, great question. I think we, and I say we on many fronts, I mean, John Barrett, I'll mention John, I'll mention Gene Gerhardt, I'll mention others who have been beating the drum for the legacy of Justice Jackson. We too beat the drum, hopefully with the same tempo and timbre, and I'm going to use I'll forget my musical terms here, but so that it is enhanced that I think some of the things we've done here have had international exposure. I think the fact we videotape everything, that it's out there on YouTube, that we've had 16 million hits Much of the archival stuff is all used to enhance the Jackson name and legacy. And that little known is the fact that we are the only standalone organization supporting and advancing the legacy of a justice of the Supreme Court. There is no other in the country.
I could follow up on that too, but our time is getting close to conclusion for today, Greg. And I have two other things that I just wanted to do at the end here. And one of them is, that was 2013. Have you called John Roberts? Has he called you anytime since then, or was that it?
Well, we've gotten together. I've seen him a couple times since. And we went down, we had a ceremony of deliverance of the bust of Robert Jackson to the United States Supreme Court. Justice Roberts permitted that bust to be on display at the Supreme Court, so when one goes to visit, you'll see it. Not every justice has a bust, and only principally chief justices are shown in the gallery. But Chief Justice Roberts permitted us to have that displayed there. It's still there. And we had a special event where we had grandchildren of Justice Jackson's, great-grandchildren, Barrett Prettyman, myself, and others there, and a ceremony to acknowledge that.
Is there anybody else out there, like John Roberts, like William Rehnquist, that you would like to have come speak next on the front porch of the Robert H. Jackson Center?
Yikes. Yeah. We've in fact had a couple, we will remain nameless, who had agreed to come. Enter COVID, and of course things got delayed, but we'll leave that announcement for another time.
Well, come on, Greg. There's no one here but you and me and Ed Tomasini.
It's true.
I'm not going to get it out of him, folks. So we'll just end that. But I must say first, thank you again to Kristen McMahon, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and everyone who works here at this place, and the use of the Kappa Theater to record these interviews. I mentioned Ed Tomasini. For all the videography that's been done in the history of the center, he has been behind the camera universally for virtually all of it. So thank you very much, Ed. We speak to you on March 10th, 2021. Greg has mentioned we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you look at the set here at the Jackson Center and the Kappa Theater, you'll see that appropriate protocols have been put in place. And you're still not going to tell me who's coming, huh?
No.
We'll be back sometime in the future. Okay, Greg.
Okay, thank you. Cindy, next
Yep.
week?
And then we'll wrap up. I really want to get you at the end, if nothing else, whatever else is left over that you want to get in here. And then to reflect on, again, on Jackson's legacy and work. And if someone were to just pick up that last one and say, well, I really want to learn something about Robert H. Jackson, here's the man who helped found his center, where would he send me? What would he direct me to in terms of what cases, what writing, what aspects of Jackson's life?
No, I think you're great. You're very good at what you do.
I'm
It's good,
working
Ed,
on
don't you think?
I'm working on it, that's all.
Yeah, keep working it, yeah. But yeah, and you got enough on Cindy so that, I think it's a two-pronged thing. I mean,
Sure.
And I don't think you have to feel an hour or less or an hour or more. I would personally like the story that Sheep could tell, because as you know, it's just no different if you had a chance to even interview your dad. It's different. It's a different. If I interviewed her, it would be different.
Oh, sure. Well, I thought I would start with her driving, and you can tell us, driving the Supreme Court Justice down to make the speech, and Sandra Day O'Connor to make the speech, and then tell us what it was like to be on the periphery of that, and then watch all of this explode in your family life.
Yep, and she's got her own little take on that, and she'll even give you the backstory of how she met Justice O'Connor, because they were enticing her to go on the board. They wanted a female attorney on the board of Chautauqua Institution. And she's young, female attorney, Bar Association president. So they were working her to be on the board, which she's accepted. So she too was on the board of Chautauqua. But the hook, they got it, man, big time. Justice O'Connor came for the first time, and they had a luncheon, and I'm sure Tom Becker had a lot to do with it. But there's, of course, tables with all dignitaries at the Athenaeum. And of course, in the center is Justice O'Connor and Dan Bratton. I walk in as a guest. Well, I'm chump change. I mean, I sit miles away. This is before there was a Jackson Center. And this is the 90s. Cindy all of a sudden is grabbed. I think Tom Becker was the vice president. Grabbed her and sat her next to O'Connor. It may have been Dan. Cindy will have to tell the story. But somebody of note, and of course, she's now, boom, O'Connor, Cindy, her hero. No question her hero, because I actually had to go out. I had a Time magazine of O'Connor on the Time magazine, and I sent it to Justice O'Connor with a note, my wife's an attorney, da-da-da-da, you're her heroine, could you please autograph it to her? And I gave it to her for Christmas, and it was one of those things. So clearly, legitimately a heroine, but now to physically sit with her, she'll tell the rest of the story because it's...
Okay, I know you have to get out of here, but first woman president, Jamestown Bar Association, first woman and first general counsel for Bush Industries. What are some of those other firsts you gave me?
First law clerk for justices in Chautauqua County. And that's Cass and Adams.
Okay.
First general counsel for Lakeshore Savings and Loan. By the way, she was involved in taking both of them public.
Bush and Lakeshore.
Lakeshore, yeah.
Lakeshore's public?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also the first, well, she was certainly the first female partner at Wright in Hampton.
Mm-hmm.
What about Howard Industries, or is that?
And now currently running, she's president and CEO of Howard Industries, which is a family business.
Okay. All right.
So there's a, and again, you're the pro at that, but you may use whatever you want to use, but there's a whole JTN Women's
Yeah.
Day story too.
Okay.